My name is Jeffrey Staley, and I am here today with Bruce Dunn and Stephen Piesco. Today we are doing a quick webinar going over some educational topics today. Today we'll be covering the uniform guidance, the new policies and procedures that are required under the uniform guidance, controls, the items that need to be documented with the guidance. Look back for GASB 68. Since it's been a year later, we're going to kind of look at what were the successes, some of the trip-ups with 68, as well as some other items to kind of wrap it up. But before we really get started, I kind of want to go through and I'm going to let you guys know what's out there in regards to the auditing environment. As most of you are probably aware, for a CPA firm to be able to do a single audit, they have to be subject to what's known as a peer review. What that means is our work has to be audited by another CPA firm. And if we're lucky enough, that our peer review will then again be selected by the AICPA for an enhanced oversight. And in essence, that work gets audited again. So it's basically audited by a superstar team at the AICPA. And what they're finding out by this A team, the superstars up there at the AICPA, is that there's been some deficiencies in the single audit arena. And the deficiencies are in regards to lack of documentation for control testing versus compliance testing. So as we go through the presentation today, as we go about updating your policies and procedures, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on documenting what your controls are and making sure those are well spelled out in your policies and procedures. And today, Steve is going to touch base on the different 12 required compliance requirements with regards to federal policies and procedures. As well, he's going to go ahead and provide you examples of what should be documented in your policies and procedures to kind of help you out in regards to the documentation, because a lot more emphasis is being placed on documentation of internal controls over your federal award programs. So let's go ahead and get started. As most of you are probably aware, the uniform guidance is ineffective for your June year ends. Uniform guidance has been basically in the works for the past 2 years. Before the uniform guidance was in effect, and in essence there were separate circulars out there, one covering education, a separate one covering state and local governments, one covering higher education and hospitals, one covering nonprofits. Those individual circulars were pretty much similar, but they also were a little bit different. So what the uniform guidance did is they brought it all under one umbrella. It got rid of any of the discrepancies between the different circulars, and now everybody's all kind of playing by the same set of rules. So there shouldn't be any difference between the different organizations in regards to applying for the single audit requirements. So some of the noteworthy changes in regards to the uniform guidance, one is you have to have a conflict of interest policy. Most school districts already have the conflict of interest. The big thing on your conflict of interest policy, you might need to beef them up a little bit, because not only are you supposed to have it, you are also supposed to outline what are the ramifications if there is any violations of your conflict of interest. If anybody breaks it, what are going to be the penalties in regards to those? And the conflict of interest policy needs to be dispersed and well known to the people that partake in the cash disbursements and the procurement process, the people that handle the bidding process, that send out the bids, receive the bids, those type of individuals. They should be well versed in regards to the conflict of interest, as well as anybody that approves vendors or as well as approves invoices. There is a mandatory disclosure that you have to put out there if there's any violations of federal criminal law involving fraud, bribery. I'm sure there's none out there, but if there is anything, you're required to disclose that. Indirect costs. If you're dealing with a nonprofit, You are supposed to accept their indirect cost rate. If you do not have an indirect cost rate and one has not been negotiated, you can fall back on the 10% de minimis rule on that. For school districts, unfortunately, this will not apply to you. You already have an indirect cost rate, so unfortunately the 10% fallback rule won't apply to you. You're kind of stuck with what you already have. Direct costs, program administrative costs can be reported as direct cost applicable to a specific program. Audit rules, the threshold for a single audit did go up from $500,000 to $750,000. If you are on that threshold, we strongly recommend that you stay in contact with your CPA firm just to make sure that if you're on that at that borderline that you let them know, because if you don't need a single audit, don't go through one. The A-level threshold increased from $300,000 to $750,000. The B-level threshold increased to floor now is $187,500. The threshold for reportable costs, the question cost, increased from $10,000 to $25,000. Most of you are probably pretty much aware of all the reporting rule changes in regards to the audit rules. Procurement, the procurement rules have changed. The limits in regards to what's required has mostly been at the federal rules. What's required for required bidding is the limits on that has increased. Unfortunately, school districts are still required to follow the state law in regards to when to bid things out. You still have to follow those bidding requirements. But what we do have here is a pretty cool procurement clause outlining what's considered a micro purchase, small purchases, sealed bid, competitive proposals, and sole sources, and as well as what are the thresholds when these certain type of requirements are required. But keep in mind, these dollar thresholds, these are at the federal level. They are not at the state level. So if you do have these types of micro purchase, small purchases, sealed bids, you can probably drop in what the state level is for the sealed bid portion and adjust accordingly to policies and procedures in regards to procurement. Subrecipient monitoring. In regards to subrecipient monitoring, this probably is going to mostly affect ISDs. For the most part, they're the ones that pass money through. The big thing on subrecipient monitoring is the fact that you have to risk assess. Probably for the most part, ISDs have already done this, and the big thing on this is you got to document the risk assessments. And what you do for one of your locals may be different than what you do for another, and that's okay as long as you properly document your risk assessment. If you have a local that has a program director that's been in the position for 25 years, no issues in regards to the single audit, no issues in regards to any types of findings or question costs or anything like that, maybe it's okay that they just send in the audit report as well as the requests for reimbursements. Or if you have another local where they have a brand new person, sending in the request may not be enough. You may have to do more training, more on-site visits, just to make sure the program is being run accordingly. That type of documentation of what you determine would be the proper oversight needs to take place. And like I said, it's probably going to affect your ISDs a little bit more than what you're going to see for your K through 12s. But that's more important this year. You know, one of the big things in regards to uniform guidance, there's a lot more stress on documentation, documentation, documentation. Compensation of personal services, there is some change in regards to documentation of personnel services. If you were to read the uniform guidance, they removed the required languages for PARS and semi-annual certifications, but there is quite a few slides in here. So don't get excited when you say, when they say you don't have to do PARS and semi-annual certifications, because like anything else in government, there's always a but. In that case, if you don't do the PARs and semi-annual certifications, you have to have some other type of internal control that properly captures the actual time spent on the program. So as you kind of flip through the slides and they outline what is required under the uniform guidance, you kind of start seeing all the different things in here. It pretty much mirrors and outlines exactly what you're doing already for the PARs and semi-annual certifications. So as Bruce always says, if it's not broke, why fix it? So since the PARs and semi-annual certifications already work, why recreate the wheel? So we highly recommend that you already keep up and continue doing the PARs and semi-annual certs because they already meet the requirements under the uniform guidance. So some of the key takeaways for the uniform guidance: one is make sure you update your conflict of interest policy. Make sure you have your purchasing policies updated. Just really spend some time going through those. Make sure that your subrecipient monitoring and your documentation risk analysis has been done. Determine if federal funding exceeds $750,000. Make sure you're in contact with your CPA firm, because if you don't need to do a single audit, why do it? And here's the big one: update your federal policies and procedures. There's a lot of generic federal policies and procedures out there. Make sure you spend some time going through there, customizing them, making sure they meet your specific organization's procedures, and make sure you document your controls. The more customized and more detail you put into those things, it's a lot easier it's going to be for you, and it's going to make your audit process a lot easier. And as well, document your performance of internal controls over compliance areas. Reporting-wise, you're not going to see a lot of change in regards to the uniform guidance. The CFA itself is not going to change significantly. There's going to be a lot of wording changes. There's no longer going to be reference to the A133. It's going to be referred to the 2 CFR aspect of it. So there's going to be a lot of wording changes. The report itself isn't not going to change significantly, but those are some of the the key areas in regards to the uniform guidance. There will be, for your ISDs though, there will be a slight change on your CFA though. I forgot to mention, on the face of your CFA, if you do have pass-through money, on the far right-hand column of your CFA, there will be a column for your pass-through money. You have to put in the dollar amount by contract, how much you pass through to your locals. That will be a little bit different, so that will increase the column size by 1 for your ISDs. But for the most part, for your K through 12s, shouldn't see a significant amount of change, just a lot of wording changes throughout the report. Steve will now go through the 12 compliance. He will provide you some really good examples of some of the things you need to have documented in your policies and procedures to kind of make sure you get through a clean audit.
All right, well, thanks, Jeff. It's Steve Piesco, as Jeff mentioned, and just to give you an overview, I'm going to touch base quickly on the 12 compliance areas required by single audit now, discuss federal policies and procedures and internal controls related to those, and then finally walk through hopefully a few real-world examples of the compliance areas and provide specific examples for both compliance and controls. And I'm going to try to focus primarily on National School Lunch and Title I, as those are predominantly the main federal programs that we'll end up testing during the audit. Like I said, the federal compliance areas, there's 12 now. For those of you that are familiar with this, there used to be 14. They've eliminated Davis-Bacon and real property acquisition. Other than that, predominantly the other 12 are consistent the way they have been. They did reword period of availability to period of performance, but basically the same procedures, or the same 12. The other 12 are pretty much the same as they've always been. As we get down to the policies and procedures, obviously we'll need those updated and eliminated for the ones that are no longer existent. Having said that, just as a precursor, this is an open book test, so everything we tell you and everything that we ask for when we're out at the audit should not be surprises for you. You need to become familiar with all these aspects from the matrix of compliance requirements, which is part of the compliance supplement. Identifies which of the 12 compliance areas are relevant for each of the federal grants. Predominantly your major ones, you need to know those for Title I, Title II, IDEA, potentially National School Lunch. If you don't know which compliance areas are relevant, then how can you follow the proper procedures? Along with that, for those major programs, they'll have specific compliance supplements relevant to them that you should also review, and as that also should probably be built into your federal policies and procedures and internal controls. When we get to those federal policies and procedures, you'll see review of the compliance supplement for applicability is one key aspect of several of the control areas. The MD&E audit manual, you should probably review that, particularly that area pertaining to the federal awards section. And then finally, the uniform guidance. This is new. It's new to us, new to everyone. But don't just rely on a 1-hour webinar and 20 minutes of updates on the uniform guidance. You should probably read that to yourself and be familiar with a lot of the major changes, at least, if not the entire document. With that, we'll get into the written policies and procedures and internal controls. I just want to reiterate, this is written federal policies and procedures, and internal controls are a required precondition to receive federal funds. If you do not have these, you should not be accepting federal funds under the federal guidance and the Uniform Grant Guidance. In general, like I said, if you had them before, make sure you update them appropriately. You need to eliminate the Davis-Bacon Act. You need to eliminate the real property acquisition aspect of that. You need to obviously eliminate A133 and A87 out of there. Those need to be updated with 2 CFR 200 and the various sections of that uniform guidance. And make sure you get all the proper updates and exclusions into your policies and procedures. Keep in mind the intent of these policies and procedures are to provide guidance to anybody spending funds within these federal grants, as well as document your controls to make sure they are spent appropriately. It's not just to be generic. You don't want to just copy the generic template we sent you. You have to update those for the various specifics of your district, from positions, people that are reviewing things, various procurement levels. If you're obviously probably not using the same thresholds that the uniform guidance uses, you have to use the ones that are specific to your district and the board approved policies for that. I do a lot of compliance monitoring for the Department of Ed on Title I funds and the consolidated application. And one of the first things we're required to ask for is these policies and procedures. We almost always get handed under the non-uniform guidance, obviously the old version that was out on MSBO or MDE's website, and it often references the wrong districts, often references the wrong things. Nothing's customized. It talks about board policies that are the same numbers as they are in the sample. Make sure they're customized, because obviously once we get them, we test them and then realize that district or academy actually doesn't do any of the things, but they have really good procedures in writing. So make sure you customize them, make sure they're up to speed with exactly what you're doing. We are going to test them, and then you'll see that. Finally, they must also include training and consequences for noncompliance. So you have to have all your procedures that you do, and at a minimum at the end, how do you train people to know what those policies and procedures are, and what happens if they don't follow them? A lot of times that references back to the contracts or various things like that for discipline action. With that, we're going to go a little more into specifics on the federal financial internal controls and procedures. Like I said, they are a precondition to receiving federal funds. What should they include? Well, they should include all 5 elements of the COSO framework. I'm sure most of you have heard of the COSO framework, or Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. They've provided the framework with 5 elements for organizations to design, implement, and evaluate controls that will facilitate compliance with requirements of federal laws, regulations, and program compliance requirements. I'll run over those real quick and give you a few examples, and then spend most of the time on the control activities, which consist of the vast majority of the federal policies and procedures. First area, control environment. What is control environment? This is the tone of the organization, or the tone from the top. It's really the foundation for all other components of the internal control structure. Just a few examples of what might consider the controls under the control environment are The Board of Education is responsible for engaging the auditor, receiving all reports and communication from the auditor, and ensuring the audit findings and recommendations are adequately addressed. The other one might be management's positive responsiveness to prior questions, costs, and recommendations, or staff knowledge about compliance requirements and being given responsibility to communicate all instances of non-compliance to management. Like I said, know the compliance supplement, because if you don't know the compliance supplement, you can't build those controls into your procedures. The second area of the COSO framework is risk assessment. This is the entity's identification of risk relevant to achievement of objectives of the grants, determining how risks should be managed, basically. Examples of this, managers and staff understand and have identified the key compliance objectives. Organizational structure provides identification of risk of non-compliance, such as key managers have been given responsibility and or communicate changes when they exist. Employees who require close supervision, new employees, again, comes back to training in that area, are identified and given that appropriate training and supervision. And there's a process established to implement changes in program objectives and procedures. The third area is the control activities. Like I said, we'll not get into that now because as the control activities are addressed in each of the compliance elements. So of the 12 compliance areas, there'll be control activities related to each one of those, and I'll give a few specific examples of those when we get to that area. The fourth one's information and communication. What is that? That's basically, are the identification, capture, and exchange of information in a proper time frame that enable people to carry out their responsibilities accurately. Examples would be employees' duties and control, responsibilities are effectively communicated, reports provided timely to managers for review and appropriate action, and accounting systems provide for separate identification of federal and non-federal transactions are a couple examples for information and communication. And the final area is monitoring. And this is basically, is there a process in place that assesses the quality of internal control performance over time? In other words, is there ongoing monitoring built in through reconciliation, staff meeting, feedback, supervisor review, and so forth? Does the Board of Education review the results of all monitoring or audit reports periodically and assess adequacy of corrective action of those things? And if there's decentralized location, is there periodic site visits to make sure they are following the appropriate actions as well? Now that I've laid down the basics for the actual federal policies and procedures and what should be included there, before I touch on the control activities, just want to go over quickly what you should expect when the auditors come out. What will we be looking for? And basically that's, when we get there, we're going to ask for your federal policies and procedures and internal controls, which is what we're just discussing now. Along with that, we're going to ask for your total preliminary federal awards. Based on those federal awards, we're going to determine your major programs, typically Title I or National School Lunch, like I mentioned. Once we identify what major programs there's going to be, we look at the compliance matrix, determine which of the 12 compliance areas are relevant to that program. And based on the relevant compliance areas, we determine those that are direct and material. Based on that, we now go back to your policies and procedures and review them and identify, hopefully you've already identified, what are your key controls or significant controls for each one of those compliance areas that we determine direct and material. We calculate sample sizes now for both compliance and control testing. As Jeff stated earlier, control testing is an increased emphasis area. While we often tested them as part of our compliance testing, there's going to need to be completely separate testing procedures now. Say we determine whatever the sample size might be for that, we'll then test the direct and material areas for controls and compliance. And anything we test for compliance, we will also test for controls. Now, just to be clear, what is a control? A control basically is what did the district do to make sure the grant's objectives was obtained, versus compliance, which is, was the grant's objective obtained? Sounds similar, but they're obviously different, as what did you do to make sure they were obtained, and then the compliance piece is, were they obtained? And then let's walk through a few just to make sure we're all on the same page here. Again, I'll focus on allowable activities, Title I and National School Lunch to the extent possible. Start with allowable activities. Allowable activities are those activities that funds can be used for, generally grant-specific, versus allowable costs, which are more general or apply to specific costs that can or cannot be paid for with grant funds in general. So having said that, when you look at the allowable cost compliance areas, what do we test? We'll get your general ledger and get a split of how much of those expenditures are payroll, how much are non-payroll, and based on that percentage, we'll come up with our allocation of, say it's Title I, 80% is payroll and 20% is not, so we'll pick maybe 20 payroll transactions and 5 general transactions. From that, we'll make sure they're allowable within the grant in specific areas, particularly with non-payroll disbursements. We'll verify that they're in your approved MEGS budget, or MEGS Plus budget, the consolidated application, that they're charged to the right account, function, and object codes. And then on the payroll side, we're going to look at your PARs and certs, like Jeff said, as we highly recommend you continue those to verify those, and as well as make sure those are in the approved budget as well. From the control objective and control activities side, now this is the last 5th part of the COSO framework, control activities. Under activities allowed or allowable costs, the control objective would be to provide reasonable assurance that federal awards are expended only for allowable activities and the costs and goods and services charged are allowed within the applicable cost principles. What are examples of control activities then? Do you have processes in place for timely updating of procedures for changes in activities allowed or allowable cost principles? And then underneath that, you'd probably want something along the lines of, does the Director of Finance review the compliance supplement annually on an annual basis, reviewing for any changes that apply to the district that year? Like I said earlier, if you don't know what the compliance supplement is and review it, you can't really build it into your controls. Another one, supporting documentation compared to list of allowable and unallowable costs. And this might be done through the Director of Finance and Program Director review of all expenditures prior to submitting for reimbursement and by comparing to the compliance supplement. So basically, as you see in the slides, there's real general control activities in there, manager approval. When you actually get to your policies and procedures that you're going to write and submit to us, you need to make those much more specific and customized to your district. The last one might be, are there adequate segregation of duties for the authorization of costs? And underneath that, you'd want something along the lines where, are there purchase orders submitted but to the business office, they're reviewed and approved by the Director of Finance, the accounts payable clerk places the order. Once the order is received, there's documentation of approval, and then it's passed on to the Director of Finance for final approval and payment. You know, that might be your significant control in allowable cost area. But you see there's several different options. So that's allowable costs and cost principles. The second one I want to hit on, the cash management. Again, control compliance from a Title I area. Did the expenses incur and were they paid prior to the money being drawn? Fairly simple, right? We get the GL, make sure there's no big accruals or items that were not paid for prior to the draw being made. From National School Lunch perspective, the compliance side of that would be, were meals served to eligible students, and were the number of meals claimed on that monthly draw consistent and supported by daily production reports. So we would test a sample of production reports rolling up to the monthly total and then agree that to the total claim for the month. From the control side, separate test again, the control objective is to provide reasonable assurance that reimbursement is requested only after costs have been incurred. So again, what did the district do to ensure that happened? That's the control. Item might be accounting systems capable of scheduling payments for AP and requests for funds prior to drawdown funds and actual disbursements of funds. The appropriate level of supervisor review and approval of cash management activities. That I'd say is the key control here. The Director of Finance approves the reimbursement request and by initialing or certifying in some way, and the Board Treasurer reviews bills for payment and monthly financial statements. So that might be your key control in the cash management area. It might just be the Director of Finance reviews and certifies the claim prior to it going out. And obviously, to the extent possible, as Jeff mentioned, the best control would be to document that control, obviously with initials that are initial and dating it, but there are several other controls that might not be as significant, but yet they're still controls, and those might be what we have to test. The last area I want to touch on real quick is the area of eligibility, predominantly focusing on National School Lunch in this area. You know, for compliance testing, as we've done in the past, you have your applications. We want to make sure that recipients eligible for national school lunch, free, reduced, or whatever level they might be, are receiving the appropriate level. How we do that, we pull our sample of free and reduced lunch applications, make sure they're completed timely, included the food stamp number, homeless foster number, so forth and so on, to make sure they're signed for and include Social Security of the parent or guardian, and then we will recalculate the income limits based on the standards and make sure whatever bucket they're classified in by the district that they properly meet those income eligibility limits. So that's that. No different than we've done in the past, but now on your policies and procedures, you also have to include those controls. In this area, the control objective, just to make sure the eligible individuals are receiving assistance and that ineligible individuals are not receiving assistance. Control activities in this area might be written policies and procedures, provide direction for making and documenting eligibility determination. The Director of Finance reviews the compliance supplement and annual income limits annually, make sure eligibility requirements for each grant are considered and discussed with various program directors or those determined eligible to make the decision of eligibility. Make sure they're documented, and when no forms are available, the district would use internally developed forms to make sure they reach compliance. Eligibility objectives and procedures clearly communicated to employees. The Director of Finance or program directors meet and review eligibility requirements regularly and programs upon approval of the grant. The program director will then communicate this information to appropriate support personnel and help them carry out program responsibilities. Key control might be authorized signature on the application with initials and date of when the income levels and eligibility requirements reviewed and approved. Another one might be process for periodic eligibility redetermination in accordance with the program requirements. So eligibility might be determined on an annual basis, but if you get new income information from them, how do you know you're following and rechecking those individuals for eligibility for free and reduced lunch? And how do you know that they're getting changed, whether reduced or increased free or reduced in 3 days or taken off the program in 10? So hopefully that helps. You'll see there are a lot of different levels of controls. Some are stronger than others. But to the extent possible, documentation is the best. That does not mean there aren't controls in place, and you just have to make sure you incorporate those into your policies and procedures. As you can see, we'll have to test those in any compliance areas that we determine directed material. And lastly, if you spend time or effort to make policies and procedures, make sure you're following them. If you have great policies and procedures and you're not following them, you really don't have policies and procedures. So with that, we'll move on to Bruce for he'll provide an update on GASB 68 and a few other changes that are relevant for the June 30, 2016 audits. Thanks.
This is Bruce, and I appreciate you coming in for the webinar today. With that, I'm going to skip all the way ahead to slide 57, GASB 68. We've talked about this. There's some new guidance that's going to come out, and we think, to be honest with you, at Manor, we're pretty proud of how we handled it last year. We weren't perfect, but on a report card, it'd be a grade that we would be proud to give our mom and dad. There's area for improvement, but we're in pretty good shape. That being said, those templates that we worked with you to try to determine that deferred outflow, and we talk a little bit of that on slide 59, we're still going to want to have you go through and update that deferred outflow from October 1 to June 30th of 16. That's going to be the area on the government-wide where we're going to have to take a look at that and report that as a deferred outflow. For those of you that have switched software, a couple things. We're going to have to get those updated, the general ledger updated for reporting, and we'll also have to go ahead and take a look at those items to see which areas are available for the report. If you've changed software, you're going to need to get with us early and often because we've worked with all the major software vendors, and we can get you the new reports and how to get those new reports. But we'd like to get those done earlier. There is going to be a 24-page guide on GASB 68 that's going to be handed out at the CPA MSBO workshop on June 8th. I was the head of the committee on that, and that's a 24-page document that should help everyone districts, auditors alike for additional guidance. So that's going to be there for additional reference in June 8th at that workshop. That'll be approved at the MDE 1022 accounting manual on June 7th. On slide 60, for those of you that really have found this thing totally interesting today, we've given you a link to the AICPA website for audit ease for additional guidance to support your situation. A couple other changes on slide 61. New internal control documentation regarding compliance areas. With the Uniform Single Audit Guidance, there's additional documentation on ours, and I'll kind of walk you through the flow chart a little bit on how we'll do this. We'll get your federal policies and procedures. Then we'll break those down into directed material, like Steve said, for each of the areas. And then once we find it's an area, we'll have a new documentation where we're going to go to your federal policies and procedures, get the policies and procedures, and get the control. Independently determine on what are common controls and what are significant or key controls. Identify the common and significant controls in each of those 12 applicable areas that are directed material, and then do specific internal control testing. What happens if we find 2 or 3 of those compliance elements and there are no controls? From a standpoint of reporting, that will probably be considered an internal control finding at the A133 level, and that'll be reported as a finding in your single audit report. And then that could either be a significant deficiency, or if it's more serious, that could be a material weakness. For many of our districts, I know you've worked very hard not to have any findings, question cost, but significant deficiencies or material weaknesses on internal control. We're not out to play gotcha, but we really do need your help in this area of emphasis area and changes on the internal control and compliance auditing testing to make sure those areas are going to be taken care of. I think what's happened in the past, we're kind of going back maybe 6 or 7 years where this was new for many of you on the single audit. We all got comfortable with it. It changed. Now there's a new emphasis area. This is the first time. We're really asking all of our school district clients to take this on an area of higher risk, internally monitor and review, update this stuff, and take a look at it before you hand it over this year. It's just a change. Another area that we're going to do from an emphasis area is we've always considered the internal IT environment or your EDP environment. That's not been new. We've had people from various updates, new clients. We typically have people go out and interview. There's been a variety of narratives. We've totally revamped and updated that checklist. And for this year, for June of 16, for all of our school district clients, you're going to have a new updated checklist to complete. There's a couple things about this. Number one, it does help us implement and document controls in relation to the IT environment with the new single audit. But more importantly, you're going to see that on some common areas that I think we all know are more critical. Cybersecurity is a big deal. Access controls, what are you doing to let people get into your system? What are you doing when people leave? How are those things developed, documented, tested, and make sure they're in place? So there's going to be a new IT checklist. Our people in the house say that's probably an hour and a half to an hour and 45-minute document to go through and complete. It's not an all-day process. It's not intended to be an all-day process, but we do think that's going to be an area that we're going to need some assistance on to help you. Footnote updates. What's going to change this year? There's going to be a few cosmetic changes, as we talked about. There's been some changes and some edits on GASB 68 and 72. So that's going to change a little bit on your investment. For those of you that are fortunate to have any investments, GASB 72 and 79 disclosures are going to be new. So we'll take a look at that. And GASB 79, many of you are invested in MyLaugh, and we believe MyLaugh will qualify as a GASB 79 compliance area type of money market account. I've been in contact with Bob Dwan last week. I was hoping I'd get confirmation from Bob back by today's webinar. I have not. But I did get an informal verbal from Bob saying he did not think that was going to be an issue at all. The other item that we see that's going to be a little bit different this year, and we've already started testing, and if those of you have we are not aware of it, this would be a great help to get this done, is in the area of bond refundings. There have been an awful lot of bond refundings or advance refundings for accounting purposes. For many of you, this might be the first time you've ever dealt with it. The accounting can be somewhat complicated if you've never seen it before. We don't want to write you up for material journal entry. So you have a bond refunding. This would be a great way to deal with it. Hello, Bruce, Jeff, Steve. I have a bond refunding. I haven't dealt with that in the past. Can you give me assistance on how that accounting should work? Do you have a template on how to do the calc? Will you do the calculation? Are there additional footnote disclosures? How does it affect my fund level statements, which it does? How does it affect my government-wide level, which it does? Does it affect my bonded debt and my related debt long-term footnotes for debt? Yes, it does. Can you provide me all that assistance? And we absolutely can. Finally, we've got some great staff here, and I absolutely positively know we've got some of the best school district clients in the state. We're proud to have you as clients. Our team is trained, ready, and willing to get out there. We're going to have a great summer. GASB 68 we're over the hump. We've been told by ORS that final report that we waited on, I can tell you right now, it came out October 19th, that will be available in mid-July, so we don't think we're going to have to delay any of the audit reports this year, and we'll be able to take that and get them completed. I'm going to kind of recap. We've thrown a lot of stuff at you. A couple of things. I want to just remind you, these federal policies and procedures, you've had these. These are not new. Now, the terminology is new, and Steve and Jeff have done a nice job. So you want to update those. You want to customize them a little bit. You want to take care of them. And I want to clarify a little bit where we see higher risk areas within testing. Most of us are much more comfortable with controls over accounting related areas like the time search, the PARs, allowable activities, whether or not you've gone through and searched for suspension and debarment. Those are for proper procurement. Those are more what I'd call accounting controls, and we're pretty comfortable about that. We've got documentation about approval of invoices and those types of controls. So part of those 12 areas, we kind of feel our districts and our clients do a pretty good job on that. And now what we're trying to do is have you refine the linkage between the policies and the procedures and really identify what you think is the real reason. Like we talked about, what's a control? We had a planning meeting the other day, and I said a control is what did the district do to make sure it wasn't screwed up before they gave it to the auditor. That's a control versus compliance testing. I'll give you a couple other areas where I think we generally find pretty well documented controls. One would be eligibility, perhaps in the area of school lunch. We do test that, have tested that for compliance, and we've seen people review those applications for that, and there's documentation for that. So that's going to be one of the 12 elements Steve talked about, where we again think that's a pretty good deal. Here's two where we test compliance regularly and you're in good shape on compliance. The control maybe isn't as well documented. One would be cash management. You have a copy of the cash draw on there, and behind it you have a copy of the general ledger, showing that the ledger expenses were slightly higher than the amount you requested. So it's clear you did not draw the money in advance. That would be how we tested for compliance, as Steve said. You've got in the folder, the draw did not exceed, you're in compliance. What is the control? Well, hopefully now you'll go back and say, well, the federal policy and procedure could be as simple as this. You know, I look at the ledger, I compare it, I do the draw is less, and my final step to make sure it's okay is I staple the ledger sheet to a copy of the cash draw, or I put it in a PDF, and I file it away. And when I file it away, that's the same as if I initialed it to say I did review that and we're good to go. So as Steve mentioned, it doesn't always have to be a written documentation. When I did the report, now there's going to be some certifications on that. When I did the report, I looked at that. When I look at budget to actual, what am I looking for budget to actual? Well, my federal policies and procedure says I look at that on a regular basis to monitor the grant to make sure revenue doesn't exceed federal expenditures. That can be another thing that could be documented, and it would be nice to supplement. How do you do that? Maybe we'll test that through inquiry and observation, because you might not have it. Many of you have implemented the Maynard-Costerisan month-end checklist. And you'll notice if you've implemented that Maynard-Costerisan checklist, we asked for that, and boy, there's about 25 things that you document that you've done. Maybe there's a few more things you want to add to that checklist to help support how did you test the control. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. Control testing over compliance testing. It's clear with the AICPA, they no longer care if the report is right and you're in compliance. That it does not get you over the goal line. They really are stuck on this increased emphasis on internal control and documentation. So we're going to be looking for that a little bit better. It's an open book test. Take a look at those federal policies and procedures. All right, so what do I do, Bruce? You've thrown a lot at us. A couple things. I'm going to go backtrack. we've talked about policies and procedures. That was in our communication a year ago. It came out in February supplement, primarily for conflict of interest and procurement. That's something that you should have been doing throughout the whole year to be in compliance. If you're out of compliance, I don't know if you can go back. If you haven't adopted those policies and procedures, can I do it before the end of the year? I guess my question was, well, if you chose not to do it for the first 11 months, I'm not real sure we care too much if it was June or July or August, but we'll probably have to write you up if it's not completed. It's better to have it implemented in place. Look at your procurement. For a lot of you, you're primarily payroll-related grants, so maybe you didn't implement the new procurement, but maybe you didn't spend anything, and maybe you were in compliance with state law that were more strict than the federal law, so for this year you'd be okay. Same with the conflict of interest. We've talked about that. Many of you use Neola for updating your policies and procedures, and maybe it's updated and you don't realize it. I think for many of you that have talked with us during the year, you do know that because the procurement policy in particular from Neola was quite confusing. So there's a couple of areas to help you try to get through that. And that federal policies and procedures, I would tell you, especially for us that are coming out for interim, I know you're busy, but I would put that very high on the list to update that, do a word replace, get rid of the A133, the single audit, the A87. And then of those 12 compliance elements, I would immediately go to each one of those. And we've read them, and we've got them in here. Many of you have controls identified. Make sure those are the controls you want us to test. Make sure if those are the controls you want us to test, when we walk in, you'll help us. What's the best way to test that control? Our goal is not to play gotcha. Our goal is to make sure you're in compliance with the control and that you're in compliance. So with that, I'm going to go back and have you write down a few of what I would call key slides on this whole thing. Slide 5 was Uniform Guidance Summary. Talks about that, as Jeff talked about. Are you or are you not subject to $750,000 requirement? Let's make sure, step number 1, we do the right audit. Let's not do a single audit if we don't need it. And I can tell you for those, and there are several clients that are going to step down from a single audit to a government auditing standards audit. The scope, procurement, and believe it or not, costs are probably going to be reduced because the testing and the procedures are less. The bear claw in the Uniform Guidance Center procurement under slide 8. Take a look at that. Try to get that implemented. Under slide 11, we talk about there, Jeff covered that. Timesheets don't change. Timesheets and semi-annual certification PARs, that's probably going to be one of the areas where you have the best documentation of your procedures and policies, and you document your controls over that. So continue to take a look at that. Slide 16 talks again a little bit about the uniform guidance takeaways. And then on slide 18, a control test versus a compliant test. And again, we deal with this when we do our internal training with our own staff over control versus compliance. Compliance, was it done right at the end of the year? Yes or no? Boom. And that control test gets back to, how did you know you're in good shape before you handed it to us? Maybe some of those controls are done on an annual basis where you reviewed certain things, you complied with it before you did the final audit binder. Maybe that's an annual. Maybe we prefer to see that monthly. But at least before you wrap it up, part of that would be one of the COSO elements is monitoring. What did we do to continue to monitor? For your ISDs on that risk-based approach, we've talked to all of our ISDs in the past about on subrecipient monitoring. That risk-based approach is something that's going to be needed to take place of. And then finally, we didn't go through all the slides today. We couldn't get through that all in an hour, but I can tell you in every one of those 12 compliance elements, we gave you five sample controls that could be used. We gave you 5 sample areas of compliance that will probably be tested. So when Steve and Jeff talked about an open book test, we really want to have you do that. So, for instance, you should also, after you update your federal policies and procedures, go back like Jeff and Steve mentioned, read the MDE audit manual. That's now finalized. It's on the MDE website. It's under the Office of Audits. Click on that for Title I, School Lunch Idea, the areas where you think are going to be your major programs. Look at those district considerations and auditor considerations. That's what we're going to test. Our testing comes almost word for word from those sections, so you should know about that. Take a look at what the big programs are, and to oversimplify it, if it was a big program last year and we tested it, probably we'll test an alternative programs. For instance, if we looked at school lunch last year, for many of you will probably look at Title I on a rotation basis. The methodology has changed on that, so we have to go through some different procedures, but for many of you, that's how that's going to continue to work. So hopefully that will help you a little bit on controls, policies, and procedures, and to make sure you get those updated. And as we've said before, for those of you that are new clients, if you'd like our template, we can get that for you. For those of you who'd like the updated template to take a look to see how that's looking in regard to your updates, that's fine and dandy. But write this last thing down. Probably question number one from your auditor when they come out for interim. Could I have a copy of your federal policies and procedures, and have they been updated for the year? So that's probably going to be rule number one, so that's probably where I would start with. For those of you that have decentralized operations, I would then take a look and talk to your head of school lunch, perhaps you're on the line, or the head of your Title I program or idea, and say, the auditors are coming out. The first question they're going to have is this. Here's the Word version of last year. We'd like to see if we could get that updated for you. And I have to tell you, thanks for calling in or to listening into the webinar. If you have any suggestions for improvements or areas that we did not cover on, or that we could have covered in more detail, let us know. Have a great day. Thanks for being our clients. Bruce.